People here have worked with John Mark in previous years for other debates, and I know we have 4 guys on this stage that know their positions very well and are very well spoken, so this should be great for all of us. Just to quickly let you guys know the format that we'll be following. This is considered policy debate format. We'll have an opening constructive argument from each one. In between, there will be 3 minutes of cross-examination. The constructives are 8-minute prepared speeches that also refer to the other constructive speeches. So they will cross-examine each other for 3 minutes, and then we'll follow up with 4 closing rebuttals, 1 from each person. So you'll hear each person speak for 12 minutes, as well as hear them question the other side. So very informative. Everyone gets equal amounts of time, as well as a little bit of prep time in between. So there might be a minute or 2 of silence while I take notes in between speeches, and you guys will just bear with us for that. Now to the introductions. Keep in mind, guys, there are no judges for this debate, no winners, no losers. Each and every one of you out there are judges for this debate. We hope you can take some information from both sides and make your own determinations. The resolution that we are debating today is, morality is not contingent upon, nor does it require, a deity of any kind. On the affirmative team affirming that resolution are Matt Dillahunty and JT Eberhard. Matt Dillahunty was a Southern Baptist for more than 20 years. Turn this one down just a little bit, guys. That's kind of hot. We're gonna get some feedback when they talk. I'm sure they can hold it closer to their mouths. Matt was a Southern Baptist for more than 20 years. He began a broad, prolonged investigation into all things religious in an attempt to bolster his faith and pursue a career in the ministry. This investigation continues, though he abandoned faith and religion in favor of skepticism, reason, logic, and scientific evidence. His interest in apologetics led to the creation of the ironchariots.org website. Matt has served as president of the atheist community of Boston since 2005. He co-hosts the group Atheist-Oriented Podcast, The Nonprofits, and hosts the group's public access television program known as The Atheist Experience. This program is a 90-minute live weekly program that takes calls from listeners around the world, prompting many debates on a variety of religious and philosophical topics. He has been hosting the program since 2004. Welcome, Matt Dillahunty. And since it's more fun to say we have 2 father and son teams, his son, JT Eberhard. JT was a campus organizer and high school specialist with the Secular Student Alliance. He's the author of the blog, What Would JT Do? And has been contributing author to atheismresource.com, my site. Before joining the SSA, JT was known most as a debater on atheism, LGBT rights, and the co-founder of Skepticon's annual conference. JT also co-founded and led the SSA-affiliated Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster in Missouri State. The group would go on to make news on several occasions, often for their unconventional approach to combating religion, such as building cardboard box forts in the middle of campus to counter-protest evangelists, or massing on their school's free speech zone with expletive-bearing signs in response to the school saying that they could ban coarse language. As a debater, he has paired with other high-profile atheists such as Richard Carrier and Victor Singer, and Matt Dillahunty today. And of course, his fiancée is our SOMA president, Michael Eberhard. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome JT Eberhard to the stage. 2 gentlemen that need very little introduction to a lot of you, and they share the same last name. Our father and son team on the negative side of the debate today are Dr. John Mark Miravalle and his father, Mark Miravalle. Dr. John Mark has been a School of Faith instructor since 2005. He received his doctorate in theology from the Regina Apostolorum in Rome. Besides teaching adult parishioners and Catholic school faculties, he also offers classes to University of Kansas students at the St. Lawrence Center. He is the author of The Drug, the Soul, and God, a Catholic moral perspective on antidepressants, and has published articles in The Thomas, the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars Quarterly, and the Homiletic and Pastoral Review, as well as in other journals. In 2010, he debated the atheist activist Dan Barker, right here on this stage, on the topic of God's existence, which was recorded and is available for online viewing. John Mark and his wife, Jessica, have 3 children and reside in Lawrence, Kansas. Please welcome Dr. John Mark. obviously, Dr. John Mark comes from good stock because I had to use like 6-point font for your bio. Mark Miravalle is a professor of theology at the Franciscan University in Steubenville, specializing in Mariology. He is, I looked it up, it's the study of the Virgin Mary, correct? See, I learned something, I was really proud of that. He is president of Vox Populi, I'm not going to say that right, my Latin is horrible. It's a Catholic movement promoting the concepts of the Blessed Virgin Mary as mediatrix and co-redemptrix. Mark Miravalle completed his undergraduate studies in theology as a student in the St. Ignatius Institute Catholic Great Books program at the University of San Francisco. He earned the Licentiate of Sacred Theology and Doctor of Sacred Theology degrees at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, Angelicum in Rome. His doctoral dissertation was on the message of the alleged Marian apparitions. Again, words I should have checked with you for. As of 2009, Dr. Miravalle holds the rank of Professor of Theology at the Franciscan University, where he has taught since 1986 and where he received several teaching awards. You can read the rest of this, as well as all of his accolades, having appeared on CNN, Latin America, BBC, Fox News, and NBC series Dateline. Please welcome Mark Miravalle. All right, at this time, I'm going to invite JT to the stage to start the debate. I will sit off to the side and will require very little moderation from myself as long as everyone follows the rules. Let's begin moral combat.
How do we resolve questions of what we ought to do? And how do we determine if we ought to change the oil in our cars? Well, it's pretty simple. If you want your car to run, you ought to change the oil in your car. But what if you're testing the effects on engines that don't have enough oil in them? Well, then you ought not to change the oil in your car. But it pretty much all boils down to what we want. If you want to be clean, you ought to take a shower. If you want to attract flies, you ought not to take a shower. And this is true even of our various religions. This is why a lot of monotheistic religions create a heaven that everybody wants to go to and a hell that nobody wants to go to. Otherwise, how could you appeal to me that I ought to obey the Ten Commandments? Because what if I determine that hell's where the party is, and then it sounds boring? What if I want to go to hell? What ought I to do with regards to the Ten Commandments then? Well, obviously, if I'm going for what I want, I should disobey them. So in order to determine what we ought to do morally, we need to figure out what desire or moral commandments satisfy in us. And I think it's a pretty easy one. We all want to be happy. This is why we all have jobs we hate, right? Because we're happier having a roof over our heads and foods in our mouths than we are waking up and going to work every day. So just like we acknowledge that if we want our cars to run, we ought to change the oil, once we realize that we want to be happy, then it's time to start insisting that we and our neighbors live in particular ways that maximize our happiness, assuming they want to be part of our society. And once we make the baby step toward deciding that living in a world where people don't regularly kill their neighbors and rape their pets and steal their pornography, when that world is better for us to live in, then we immediately have all the motivation we need to conceive of moral rules, i.e., I won't steal from you if you won't steal from me. Now, a possible objection to this is, whose happiness do we maximize? What would I say to the person who says they'd be happier stealing a stereo than not stealing the stereo? And what I'd say to them is that we share happiness and sadness, and happiness is maximized by living harmoniously. We look no further than our reaction to the Boston Marathon bombings to realize how happier we are working together and not doing harm to one another. What's more, smiles are contagious, right? And we cry at movies, or at least I cry at movies, and we're revulsed by blood and suffering in horror movies. And nobody thinks for a minute that these represent real human suffering, and yet they affect us in very real ways. This should confirm that to an extent, we share the emotional states of other people, and that our own happiness is dependent on ensuring that other people are happy and don't suffer. What's more, countless studies have shown that people who steal or otherwise do harm to their fellow humans are actually less happy. So to the person who says they'd be happier stealing the stereo or committing mass murder than race in New England, I'd simply say that people can be wrong in their assessment of what will make them happiest. I mean, every person in this room has probably experienced this. I thought I'd be happier going to prom. Wrong. And in this case, objectively, The people who say they'd be happier disregarding things like the golden rule and other sound moral precepts are probably wrong, and would realize this if only they had a broader basis for comparison. I'd also tell them that if you repeatedly harm other human beings, you run the risk of being ostracized from society. I mean, this is what happens to people who are dangerously bereft of empathy. But being part of society makes you happier, objectively. I mean, think about it. Do you like the benefits of other people's minds, like cell phones and grocery stores? Good! Then you realize that your happiness cannot be maximized without being part of society at large, and that teamwork is objectively better for living a happy life. Which leads me to another possible objection. Without God, our morals are subjective and just a matter of mere opinion. To this I'd say that just because we don't have the means to maximize human happiness completely figured out, doesn't mean that questions of human happiness are subjective. Take something like chemistry. The interaction of different elements is about as objective truth you can get about the nature of the universe. And in order to realize that, we come up with something like the periodic chart. However, the periodic chart has gone through several different variations over the years, not because the nature of chemistry is subjective, but because our understanding of it gets refined over time. Well, moral rules are the same way. The fact that we're still refining our understanding of what makes humans happiness doesn't mean that the assertion that giving a sandwich to a hungry person is not objectively better than, say, setting them on fire. Exaggerations like this show that we can tell the difference between what makes someone happy or sad objectively. And all we do from there, all we've ever done from there, is just refine, refine, refine. Not only does this system require no appeal to God, it would make no sense to give God the credit for the system even if you tried. If moral rules are conceived by people from different cultures without supreme knowledge about what maximizes human happiness, then we'd expect some disagreement about what the moral rules should be. However, if God created moral rules, we'd expect there to be much more agreement on them, since he could have made the moral facts of the universe as undeniable to us as the fact that gravity exists. Why would a God create moral rules he wanted us to follow, and then leave us so confused about what so many of them are? What's more, compassion-based morality exists quite clearly in other animals. Take piranhas, for instance. Bloodthirsty as all hell when they're feeding, but they don't eat each other. Another example would be in 1964, Jules Masterman ran a study with rhesus monkeys, where he put a bunch of rhesus monkeys into a cage and arranged it so that in order to get fed, they had to pull a lever that shocked one of their cage mates. Some of these monkeys went up to 14 days without food, just so they wouldn't harm one of their cage mates. Now, these animals don't believe in God, so there must be something in their neurochemistry that motivates them to care about compassion. And the explanation is very simple in terms of biology, and I can go into more details of this should it get contested in the process. Species that felt no remorse for harming one another would die out, leaving us only with species that aren't inclined to harm one another and which are naturally motivated towards teamwork. Once you concede that an aversion to killing each other is good for survival, which I hope that's a pretty easy concession for everybody to make, you admit that this is precisely what we'd expect to see in a godless universe. But it makes no sense to credit God for natural processes like evolution by natural selection, which require no appeal to God at all. And also, if a God exists, it has given us tendencies that compete with what makes us optimally happy. An example would be being out of shape objectively makes people less happy. Yet anybody who's ever been on a diet knows how miserable it can be in the short term to suppress our desire to eat food that tastes really, really good, and lots of it. Now, unless God is a practical joker and very poor taste, this is absolutely bizarre on theism, but again, makes perfect sense on naturalism. Down to 1 minute, so okay, we're going to be here. We'll just get to the end. There's something in us when we read the horrors in our holy books. An example would be Exodus 35:2 in the Bible that says you should kill anybody who works on a Saturday. There's something in us that enables us to read passages like that and say, this is not moral. This was never moral. It never be thought to be moral. It's obvious that we need nothing more than an interest in societal happiness and reason, both of which we have, to explain our revulsion to those decrees. Where religions have rules that mirror the reasonable conclusions based upon compassion, they're indistinguishable from what we should already want for ourselves, whether God exists or not. And where the rules of our religion stand in opposition to compassion and the well-being of humans, they simply cannot be called moral. Where religious prescriptions for behavior inhibit human happiness, you become a villain, not a saint, by compliance. Thank you. My background's in music, so I'm going to give like musician on stage pose here.
Thank you, JT. You're welcome. Apart from many particular cases, which I would take exception both historically and factually, and especially the biblical element, I'd rather ask a question that kind of seems to summarize what I perceive to be your overall position. That is, that essentially, as people experiment, the greatest good for the greatest number will come forward, that happiness will be achieved by having the majority have happiness versus what perhaps may not be best for the minority. And what concerns me about that is that there's a fear for minorities. It seems to me that you're saying that the best we can do is get the greatest good for the greatest number, but how do you protect minorities, minority races, a minority of Jews in a predominant Germany? How do you protect gay rights in a society that doesn't think a gay person deserves fundamental rights? So,
you give me an example where augmenting the greater happiness that we all share. So our own happiness is tied to the happiness of others around us in society. Can you think of an example where maximizing happiness for everyone would require us to kind of move on the minority?
Sure. I think I'm supposed to be asking you the question, but I'm happy to answer.
I'm sorry.
The dimension of...
I guess the answer can take the form of the question.
Fine. Go to Australia, the lost generation, when it was perceived that happiness of the greatest number of Australians would be benefited by taking the Aborigines and preparing them to be servants. The majority caused oppression to the minority, and that's a position that I don't think is a viable moral position.
Okay, now you're saying that in Australia they thought that taking the Aborigines and suppressing them would augment human happiness. I realize that can be asserted, but can that really be defended as something that makes society better by suppressing a minority? I mean, look at all the tyrannies in the history of humanity where we suppressed a minority. How did slavery work out? How did Xerxes' suppression of minorities work out? It wound up with his rebellion and death. Whenever we repress minorities, we wind up with rebellions, we wind up with a discordant, inharmonious society. And I would argue that even though it can be asserted that that would maximize human happiness for everybody, that it can't be defended at all.
I don't know, I can respond. Thank you. I would simply say that's not good enough. Okay, so let me put it in a form of a rhetorical question.
You've done this before.
It seemed to me that you're not protecting the atheist or the theist when you are saying that eventually we'll get past killing Jews, eventually we'll get past doing what we did to the minorities in Australia. And it would seem to me that that's not a valid moral principle that defends the personal good of the atheist or anyone else.
I'm not saying that we'll ever get past that, because I don't know what the future brings for humanity. What I am saying is that anybody who is asserting that doing that maximizes human happiness, you can't defend it. Obviously it creates discord in societies. And what's more, even if I can't quantify the amount of human happiness, that doesn't unmake the argument that trying to maximize human happiness is what we ought to be doing.
So thanks all for coming out. I guess I'll stand. Thanks, Matt and JT. It's good to see you again, JT, and Dad. Obviously, thanks so much for coming out. So obviously, hopefully obviously, what Dad and I will not be arguing is that you need to believe in God to be good. It's that you need to believe in God to make sense of your ability to distinguish between right and wrong in the first place. So I will be arguing that it doesn't make sense to believe in morality while not believing in God, and Dad will be arguing that because we can't know that God exists, we can know that He is actually the source of morality. Again, the main question, which I was glad to see JT was working for, is where does morality come from? What is the basis for the difference between right and wrong? Now, his answer seemed to focus on happiness. My concern is that he's not defining happiness at all. Because clearly, there are some definitions of happiness which cannot reasonably be claimed to be the source of human morality. For instance, if you define happiness as feeling good, which JT seemed to be doing at a certain point, well then obviously you could never make sacrifices for the sake of doing what's right, because a sacrifice by definition is where you give up feeling good in some respect in order to do what's right. Now, he seemed to be saying that, well, in the long run. Well, in the long run, for whom? In the long run, in what respect will we all feel better if we're moral? I don't know if you ever saw this movie, Owning Mahoney, but it's a true story about a gambling addict, and he has to give up his gambling because he's spending millions of dollars of his own bank's money, and his therapist says, what's the greatest pleasure in your life? He says, gambling. On a scale of 1 to 100, how great is it? He says 100. He said, what's the next greatest pleasure in your life? Mahoney says, 20 on a scale of 1 to 100. And his therapist says, can you live with 20? And Mahoney says, yeah, I can live with 20. The point being that even if his life has a drastically reduced pleasure experience for the rest of his life, it is still the right thing for him to give up gambling because it's bad for him. So clearly, on any reading, feeling good cannot be the basis for what's right. But if you define happiness, as some do, and as I would, as fulfilling your purpose as a human being, then yeah, I think pursuing happiness in that sense is the basis for morality. But of course, then the question comes, where does this purpose that we're trying to fulfill come from? Let's look at it this way. We recognize that what something is supposed to be or what it's supposed to do depends on the purpose it was given by the one who made it. Such that, if something hasn't been made by someone for some purpose, there's no way to say what it's supposed to be or what it's supposed to do. And I'll give you a couple examples. My son likes to paint, but he's only 5, so I can't always tell what it is he's painting. So suppose I go into his room and I see a piece of fresh paper on his desk, and it's got, a piece of paper on his desk, and it's got fresh paint on it. I might say, oh, what's this supposed to be? Which is what I usually say when I see fresh paint on his paper. And he might say, well, actually, Dad, I spilled that paint by accident on the paper, so it's not supposed to be anything. Because he didn't make it with some purpose, it's not supposed to be anything. Or suppose I'm out sawing wood in my shed, and my son comes out and he says, Dad, what's all this sawdust for? What's this sawdust supposed to do? What are you supposed to do with all this sawdust? Now, of course, the sawdust is an unintended byproduct of some other process. So I would say, actually, it's not really for anything. Not supposed to do anything with the sawdust, so you can do whatever you want with it. You can use it for your gerbil cage, you can use it for kindling, you can mix it with milk and serve it as cream of wheat to beavers, I don't care. That was weird, but it was all I could come up with, I'm sorry. The point is, because I didn't make it for some purpose, there's nothing it's supposed to do. Okay, now apply that to morality. Morality is where we talk about what human beings are supposed to be versus what they're not supposed to be, what human beings are supposed to do versus what they're not supposed to do. So, apply the principle. Unless human beings have been made by some person for some purpose, there's no way to answer the questions that morality poses. There's no way to talk about what people are supposed to be versus what they're not supposed to be. There's no way to talk about what they're supposed to do versus what they're not supposed to do. The only way to make sense of the whole moral endeavor is to say, yeah, we've been created by someone with some goal in mind. That's a universal principle. And if Matt and JT disagree, here's the challenge. Find a counterexample. Show me something where we talk about what it's supposed to be versus what it's not supposed to be. Where we talk about what it's supposed to do versus what it's not supposed to do, even though we know it hasn't been made by some person for some purpose. Like I said, I don't think they're going to be able to come up with that example. But then, human morality, which is speech about what human beings are supposed to do versus what they're not supposed to do, what human beings are supposed to be like versus what they're not supposed to be like, that speech implies that we have been made by someone for some purpose. Morality implies God. Without it, moral speech just doesn't make sense. Thanks so much.
Not rebut, just question, right? Okay.
You'll get your chance.
You claim that human beings have a particular purpose. Can you demonstrate that I have any of the purposes that you claim?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
You claim that we have particular purposes and that we were made to achieve certain things.
Sure.
Can you defend why I have a particular purpose? Or if you claim human beings have a particular purpose to, say, love another particular person or to believe a particular thing, can you demonstrate that with evidence?
Yeah, morality is the evidence. The fact that we believe, for instance, that it's better to know truth as opposed to not know truth, that it's better to love as opposed to not love, means that this is what human beings are supposed to do as opposed to what they're not supposed to do. Again, the only time we talk that way about anything else is when we're talking about the purpose with which and for which the thing's been made.
Okay. You said that purpose is derived from having goals in mind. What is wrong with happiness as a goal? Why can happiness itself not be sufficient?
Again, I didn't say that morality or purpose, purpose and having a goal in mind are equivalent. I didn't say that morality is tied to having any purpose, any goal in mind. We can certainly set ourselves all kinds of immoral goals. We can give ourselves all sorts of immoral purposes. If I want, I can set the goal of, being rude to 10 people today. That doesn't make it a moral goal. What I'm saying is that morality is a specific type of goal. As we've just seen, it's not the same as goals we set ourselves, since we set ourselves both good goals and bad goals. And therefore, morality implies that someone else has set us this specific goal that we can either fail to achieve or succeed in achieving.
You set a goal, find something that has a purpose that wasn't made by something. Is that correct? Phrasing?
That's right. That's right. That's my challenge.
If I can point to something, hypothetically, that is clearly explicable through natural means, i.e. mindless forces acting upon inanimate objects, would you accept that as something that was not made by a being?
Yeah, two problems with that. No, one is you haven't proved that, for instance, a rock or a tree isn't made by someone. And secondly, typically we don't talk about what a rock is supposed to be versus what it's not supposed to be. We don't say, that's not what a rock's supposed to be, you lousy rock, right? We talk about what a rock is or what a rock does. So I think both of those, for both those reasons, that sort of example would fail.
In your example of the gambler, you said you gave up 100% in the short term for 20% in the long term. Do you feel like you're glancing over all of the misery that went with the short-term gambling that might lead to his pursuit of longer-term happiness?
Yeah, what I think is very clear is that if you go to him with a calculus of what feels better versus what doesn't feel as good, he would say, that's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because it's wrong to pursue this lifestyle. I think moral people would give you that answer across the board. And he would say, right, because he may die the next day, and still it's the right decision, even if he never kind of totals out in pleasure on the long run.
Thanks.
expanding on that idea by addressing the structure and process of constructing a secular moral system. The most common objections to simple consequentialism, which is not what I'm advocating, by the way, are things like, how do we determine whose happiness to prioritize, what makes me happy causes somebody else to suffer, But I don't look at things in terms of simply happiness and suffering. Those are legitimate questions, but they don't represent intractable problems for secular moral systems. In fact, I'm aware of no objection to secular morality that is both a legitimate problem and solved by theistic and religious moral systems. JT and I may not agree on all the details and may answer questions differently. Some people may look at this as a problem and will claim, well, you've got no ultimate moral authority, so you're just stuck with moral relativism and no solutions. That's not actually true, and yet, even if this were a real problem, appealing to God doesn't solve it. Because I can stand here and say that I don't agree with God's proclamations about morality, and you can disagree with both me and that God, or any number of other gods. And why should I pay attention to the ideas or the views of an individual, God or not, whose reason seems to be nothing more than because I said so, or worse and more accurately, because somebody told me that's what God said. I can answer 45-minute talk into 8. So the secular moral system that I advocate actually does have a path to resolution, and it's a pathway that allows us to sort out where and why we disagree in order that we might improve our understanding of morality and also improve the structure of our moral system. This pathway is built on a foundation of reason, evidence, and empathy. It's based on understanding and recognizing the foundational truths upon which we base morality. With reason, empathy, and compassion, JT and I can figure out why we disagree, and we stand a good chance of changing that. I've spoken in the past about how secular moral systems are superior to religious moral systems. In fact, I think secular moral systems are the only true moral systems, and that religious moral systems aren't systems at all, but are basically pronouncements about morality. They don't offer a mechanism or method for evaluating and resolving moral questions. It's usually little more than one claim after another with no actual regard to why. The biggest problems, though, are the fact that they are externally oriented, someone else is deciding your major for you. Inflexible, they offer no path to improved understanding, and you cannot correct dogmatic foundational values. If our opponents are arguing on behalf of theism alone, and I have no idea if that's actually what they're doing, but it could be, then they've already lost. Theism is the belief that a God exists. That proposition on its own tells us nothing about morality. In fact, I could concede right now that a God exists for the sake of argument, and it doesn't give us one bit of information about what that God wants or thinks. It doesn't tell us whether that God is good or evil, an evaluation we must make for ourselves using reason, evidence, and empathy. Theism alone cannot serve as a moral system or even a moral foundation, because whether a God exists is separate from what that God thinks about morality, which is also separate from whether or not we know what this God thinks about reality, which is also separate from whether or not this God is correct about morality. Curiously, moving from theism to actual religions doesn't solve the problem, it amplifies it, which is why there are 1,000 denominations of Christianity and tens of thousands of denominations of other religions that don't agree on morality or much of anything else. So the facts that we use to build a moral system. Number one, we are physical beings in a physical universe. Our actions have consequences to ourselves and others, and those consequences are also physical, which means there are truths that we can discover about these interactions, and we can evaluate them. We're neither aware of, nor should we be concerned about, magical, supernatural, additional concerns. In the same way that we can address physical well-being, which we often label as health, thank you, Sam, we can begin to assess well-being in a broader context: mental well-being, societal well-being, individual well-being, group well-being. Number two, for any situation, there is a finite set of possible actions that one can take. The consequences of those actions can be assessed with respect to their impact on well-being. Clearly, some consequences are going to be better than others, and that's all we need to get started. Those that improve well-being, and there can be many of them that improve well-being to different degrees, the fact that we can't quantify it or even necessarily tell which one might be better doesn't change the fact that they are all improving, are evaluated as morally good or right. And the ones that decrease or detract from well-being are evaluated as morally evil or wrong, and there are things that are evaluated neutrally. But the fact that we can comparatively rank these evaluations means also that there must be some set of one or more actions that represent the moral pinnacle or moral absolute for that situation, not for every situation. I'm not talking about an absolute, universal absolute, but for that situation. And that's the level at which we discuss things. We strive to compare similar situations. We compare the consequences of our actions to the values that we've based on improving well-being, and we leverage that information to make it easier to address similar situations in the future, creating a complex mesh of moral framework. But what about the values that we're assessing them with? Why those values and not others? Morality, as I use the term, is about well-being. It's not about, nor does it require, an externally intended purpose, and any more than our health requires a purpose. It's simply a fact about who we are in the universe in which we live. If someone means something else by the term, then we're clearly not talking about the same thing. I'm interested in well-being. And I'm convinced that the normative use of morality in conversation, because I don't have a bunch of degrees, is that morality points to well-being. That's all that we're all really talking about when we talk about this term. Defining morality as what God wants, or in accordance with God's nature, is simply cheating in an unsupported assertion, and it means that you're talking about something other than what I'm talking about. You can actually, so you can actually construct the foundation of moral values rather easily, and it doesn't matter if you begin with arbitrary or even incorrect values, because the system and the fact that we're talking about well-being allow for the correction of even those core values. Secular morality is about getting better at getting better. Generally speaking, you can start with things like life is preferable to death, health is preferable to sickness, freedom is preferable to slavery. And if we begin with those, we can build this system. And the system that we build is also flexible enough to correct even those core values. I'm going to skip to my resolution thing today. The resolution is morality is not contingent upon, nor does it require a deed of any kind. We've shown, and we should understand, that morality, founded on our well-being, is rooted in discoverable truths. Not only are gods not required, the existence of a God adds no useful information to the discussion, and even if a God were to tell us directly its views on morality, those views stand or fall based on the evidence, not the author. Whether or not a God conveys views on morality, we're still forced to use our brains and our empathy to determine whether or not the claims are reasonable and true. I'm always curious how Christians, for example, determined that God is the good one and Satan is the evil one, without simply asserting that that's the case. What was their standard of evaluation? Because using God as the standard of evaluation is circular reasoning. Meanwhile, I'm free to evaluate both of them and find them both to be horrible moral foundations, whether they exist or not. Thanks.
Everybody can hear me? Yeah? Good. So you mentioned real briefly, actually just mentioned, reason and compassion. I would love to hear you define reason.
Define reason. Reason is a process of thinking that conforms to the logical absolutes that are the foundation of rational thought.
Okay. So anytime you know something true, you're reasoning?
No. Well, now we're into discussions about whether or not I actually know or I'm just claiming that I know.
No. I'm asking reason. Generally, I think, as I understand, most people would say reasoning is a process of going from, validly, of going from one set of propositions to another proposition. You okay with that?
Yeah, if you have a syllogism that is valid, then true premises lead to true conclusions.
Great. So could you give me, since you say that we get our moral truths from reason, could you please give me a syllogism where, without invoking value language in the premises, you get to the conclusion some behaviors are right and some behaviors are wrong?
Could I give you, construct and apply a syllogism to do that?
I mean, well, you said it comes from reason, so presumably you can show me how.
Sure. Whether or not I can actually construct a syllogism on the fly for that is another question. My response would be that to the extent that this would be true for questions about my physical health, like drinking battery acid reduces my physical health, to the extent that I can construct a syllogism along those lines, we could do similar things about well-being in the broader sense.
Yeah, my problem is, as I said, if you're going to derive values from reason, that means it can't already be in the premises. That's called begging the question. So if you start with well-being, then you can't form a valid syllogism that leads to insights about well-being.
Yeah, so I'm starting with well-being and you're objecting to starting with well-being.
It comes from reason.
The thing is that, as I said, when I say morality, I mean more well-being. That's all I'm talking about. If we can't agree that it's about well-being, then we're going to continue to talk about, and we're never going to be able to talk about the same thing.
No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is you're saying morality comes from reason, but you're also saying that what comes from reason comes as the term of a valid reasoning process. We agree on that. So please show me how you get morality, aka well-being, as the term of a syllogistic or any other validly rational process.
Well, if you're going to deny that I can use well-being as the foundation, then I can't.
You were the one who denied it because you said that our sense of well-being comes from reasoning, which you admit.
No. I'm asserting that morality is about well-being, and that we can then reason beginning with the agreement.
Oh, good. Okay, good. So you're saying we start with well-being,
yes,
and then we get to good. So where do we get that premise?
Where do we get the premise
of
of well-being?
How do we know what counts as well-being versus what doesn't, since now we know it is not derived from reason?
It's derived from who we are. In the same way that physical health is simply a fact, well-being is the label we put on health in broader contexts about individuals and societies.
I'd like to begin by thanking, of course, Matt and JT and Adam. Special thanks to John Mark. It's a real honor for me as a father to be invited to debate alongside my son. I know many fathers debate with their sons, but it's nice to debate alongside my son. And I will be maintaining that it is reasonable both to hold in God's existence and that God would reasonably instill an order in humanity. Now, and some of this comes from Matt's comments of kind of the frustration of having someone just have a presupposition without defense. And so in that light, I want to just spend a few of the precious minutes in making reference that indeed God does exist as a reasonable premise, and also it's reasonable that because he exists, he would put an inbuilt, reasonable system of moral order in humanity. So, why does God exist? Why is it reasonable to hold so? Because it is reasonable to maintain the existence of a perfect, uncaused, necessary, absolute standard, unmoved mover, who indeed is the reason for effects today. And I want to say from the beginning, this is not first to defend a religious position. This is to explain why you're out there, and I'm here, why there are effects today. Because logic holds that if I see a baby as an effect, I conclude to parents as a cause. If I see a lawn mowed as an effect, logically I conclude to a lawnmower. These are reasonable things. It's also reasonable to maintain ex nihilo nihil. From nothing, nothing comes. You can't get something from nothing. That's also reasonable. It's also reasonable to hold that if you are a dependent being, and you realize, even on a good affirmation day, look in the mirror, that I did not bring my own existence as part of my essence. I didn't bring myself into being. And therefore, if you have a dependent being, and you are a dependent being, it's logical to conclude to an independent being. It's also logical to hold that if we could say a Mother Teresa is better than an Adolf Hitler, there must be an absolute standard of goodness by which to compare. That's also reasonable. So I would hold to the reason of an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover, a designer, an organizer, an independent being, and a being that is the standard of perfection. Now I would also hold that it's reasonable that this being that did give order to the universe also gave order to the high point of the universe, which is the human being. It would be illogical, I would hold, to say he stops with the order of the universe, with the orders of the human body, with the orders of nature, with instinct in animals, but when he comes to the high point, a creature that has an intellect and a will, he's not going to give an order. And so I would hold whether you call it a conscience, an inner voice, and I know Matt, I think previously mentioned the voice thing as a problem. Let's just say an inner directive to do good and avoid evil. Whether it's natural law, which says, indeed, human beings do have an order and can universally recognized in a fundamental way to do good and to avoid evil. I'd also say to have the premise that
Order comes from chaos is illogical. Chaos begets chaos in the material order. You can do an example yourself. You don't have to be a scientist. Don't cut your front lawn this summer. Don't affect any ordering of the chaos of your front lawn, hoping that there's going to be order in the summer. It's not going to happen. If your finances are presently in chaos, and you decide, I'm not going to do anything about it, you will have more material chaos. Even things like laundry, and I was thinking of hair, but there's at least 3 of us who handle that don't have enough matter to... Thanks for the hair help on that, too. So, I would again say it's illogical to hold that chaos begets order. And yet we do see an order. Science does testify to an order. Now, I would also hold that there's a fundamental problem in the objections that would have positions saying that indeed there's no God and there's no morality. And I think the foundation of the objection is accepting empirical data rather than certain truth as a standard. For example, I don't have any divine DNA, and therefore I could not conclude to a divine being. There's no massive divine footprint that I can measure. And it's almost like 2 boys on the playground saying, one boy says to the other, if you can't jump 25 feet in a standing long jump, you're no athlete. Well, the other boy has 2 options. He can either say, all right, I'm going to try, and he gets maybe 3 or 4 or 5 feet. I guess there's a third option. As a second, he could say, well, you know, the Norwegian jumper, Eberhard, only got 12 feet and 2 inches, and so your standard is too high. Or you can simply say, no human could do that. I could still be an athlete and not make the jump. And it is analogous to saying, I demand empirical evidence for God and a God-given morality. It's an unjust standard. And we do use reason, intelligence, logic, not arbitrariness, to come up with truths that are very important to us. For example, I'm sure Matt loves his wife, but he can't give empirical evidence for that love. I'm sure JT doesn't think we're in a collective hallucination. Somebody said you might use Matrix, but I'm too old to understand the Matrix yet, so that we're not all under collective hallucination. That cannot be empirically proven. So let's be clear. A mathematical, scientific, empirical standard for truth is a false standard. And we don't, for example, what lab experiment tells you that rape is evil? What mathematical equation tells you that strong and torture occur? These are certain truths, important truths, and we don't have reason. So let me end with just a brief account. Let's say you have a 7-year-old boy talking to the mother. He goes up to his mom and says, Mommy, prove to me that you love me. And the mother's patient and says, well, honey, I can't prove it the way you're asking me to prove it, but look what I do for you. I love you. I care for you. I nourish you. I'm always there for you. So I'm here. I do care, and I love you. The little boy says, not good enough, Mommy. Prove it. The mother says, sadly, honey, I can't prove it the way you want. But I will tell you, I am here for you. I care for you. And I love you. And I hold the same for God. It's reasonable to hold. He is here for us. He does care for us by instilling a moral order that's been universally granted, and that He loves us. The last part is just my belief. The rest is reason. Thank you.
So I'll start with the end, with the cute story about the child and the mother, because unfortunately that mother couldn't, and that's what she says. I can't prove it to you in the way that you're asking. Why is it that God can't?
Okay. So the difference between God can't and God won't. But let's start with our premises, because I appreciate the previous debates that you want foundations, you want presuppositions, so I want to give those to you. What I'm saying is not a reasonable standard, but an empirical standard. That seems to be what's required. That unless there's a mathematical certainty, it's really the continuation of Descartes. This is enlightenment philosophy but for the present. That I must, as a standard for truth, deny anything under skepticism that I can't have scientific, empirical, or mathematical data. And that's what's now being imposed on this discussion. And what I'm saying is that there's a significant difference between empirical data and reasonability. Why you can say...
Sure,
why you can't... I want to give you foundation.
I'm trying to figure out if the time belongs to the question or
Well,
not.
I want to give you foundation. So, if you're asking the question, and we're going to go back to the mother's example, if you're asking the question, is it reasonable? Yes, the mother's shown dozens of reasonable expressions of caring and being present. Can the mother show it in a lab dish? No. Does she have empirical data? No. That doesn't mean it's not true. Now, ultimately, to your question, I would say this too. Sometimes God's freedom is used as a beating club against his existence. That is, if you want a full freedom, you can't have a full manifestation. And if you want to exercise full freedom, you shouldn't be surprised that there's not God coming to the front door and saying, "Hi, I'm God." But that doesn't take away the reasonable presence for both God and his moral order.
Okay, so I got like a minute left. Let me but now we're good because you have this scenario, of course, where the child is talking with the mother and the mother's answering. I'm curious if the child was talking to the mother and the mother was nowhere to be seen and didn't answer, and instead some friend of the family tried to explain all the things that the mother had done with the child.
That's a very false analogy, because I would say that, as I said at the beginning, God is present in the universe, in the human person, in the intricacies, in free will, in rationality, in most every aspect of what we see our events today.
Okay. Will you all wait while I run to the restroom?
Except for a quick bathroom break, which we are not going to take off of prep time. Both teams will be able to use the additional 5 minutes split up amongst yourselves to add to your speeches. In other words, if you go up to 5 minutes over, that is okay, and I won't stop you, all right? 2.5 then per rebuttal, 5 minutes total per team. So it gives you a little bit more time. Yeah, 6.5 minute speeches, in other words, if you need it. Guys, please welcome John Mark Miravalle back to the stage for the first negative rebuttal.
All right. Good. So again, the question was, as I see it, where does morality come from if not God? Again, I don't think I've heard any strong answers. Now, here's one thing that really has to be ruled out very quickly that people will do. I call it the value language synonym game. And it's where you say, hey, what makes good good and bad bad? What's the basis for that distinction? And they say, well, what's good is beneficial or advantageous or helpful. And what's bad is harmful and hurtful and negative, right? In other words, they just keep going on and on depending on how big their thesaurus is, finding different words for good and different words for bad. Well, of course, finding different names for the same thing is no substitute for giving a clear, helpful description or explanation. So, for instance, when Matt explains morality, and we say, what's morality? Where does it come from? And Matt says, well, it's about well-being. Okay, well, what determines well-being? Well, it's about good consequences. Well, there's good again. There's well in well-being. It's about getting better at better. Well, my goodness, there it is. Values language synonym game at its finest. That doesn't answer the question. Compassion
Does compassion answer the question? No, it doesn't. As anyone who's seen that old movie, Arsenic and Old Lace, can tell you. If you remember that old movie, you have these two ladies who feel so badly for poor elderly men that they go on a killing spree to wipe them all out. Even though the old men, by the way, don't want to be wiped out. There was recently an award-winning short story by Angela Newman about a 13-year-old girl. She's just lost her father. She's in mourning. She's feeling terrible. And her father's adult male friend takes pity on her, and to try to make her feel better, he sexually stimulates her. And so in both of these scenarios, you have compassion fueling, in the one case, murder, in the other case, statutory rape. But if compassion can fuel bad actions as well as good actions, then clearly it's no criterion for the difference between good and evil. It's no explanation for where morality comes from. Matt said that pain is generally less preferable than pleasure, that death is generally less preferable than life. And I suppose that's true, but it does us very little good in this discussion, because what do you do with exception cases? What do you do with people who prefer to deal in pain and death? What do you do with someone like the Kansas serial killer BTK, who liked to torture and murder? You could say, of course, well, his are wrong, his feelings are wrong, his preferences are wrong. I quite agree. But on what basis? If preference isn't... Now, maybe he meant, when he said generally, maybe he meant, the majority. Preference is how we determine right from wrong. I think we've seen that's not true. I think Dad's example from Australia, anytime you say, yeah, the preferences of the majority are good just by being the majority, what you're saying is that the majority is right just by being the majority, and the kind of alarming implication is that the minority is wrong just by being the minority. I don't think anybody wants to say that in America today. I certainly wouldn't. If the minority isn't wrong, though, just by being the minority, then clearly the majority isn't right just by being the majority. Sometimes the majority needs to get its preferences more in line with what's actually right. We call that social reform. So, again, no good explanation. And that shouldn't surprise us, right? That shouldn't surprise us. It shouldn't surprise us that atheism is not able to give a good explanation, a good account of where morality comes from, because ultimately I think that's what atheism is. It is the systematic failure to answer the big questions. Atheism cannot answer the question why. And so, atheism cannot answer the question, why should I? Theism can. Matt said, I couldn't believe it, Matt said that theism gives us no insight into morality. Yes, it does. It tells us where it comes from. I'd say that's a pretty big insight. If you're interested in knowing the implications of your own worldview, I'd say that matters. A lot of atheists know this, of course. A lot of atheists recognize that God and morality rise or fall together, that they're necessarily connected. And so a lot of atheists will try to become intellectually consistent by rejecting morality as well as God. A lot of them have done it. Well, how much better would it be in every sense of the term, both rationally and morally? How much better would it be if instead of rejecting both, they accepted both? If they accepted God as a necessary precondition for morality? That wouldn't just be the more reasonable thing to do. That would be the right thing to do. Thanks very much.
Quick question. I can go after both of their openings, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah, you're rebutting the team, not an individual.
All right. In his opening, John Marx said, a definition of happiness as feeling good doesn't work. And this is why he said so. You can never make sacrifices. Not true at all. All you have to do is realize that you would rather sacrifice yourself than go on living having not made that sacrifice. All you have to value is courage over life. And at that point, it makes complete moral sense under the system I provided. He talked about the gambling analogy where he said the gambler gave up 100% happiness for 20% happiness. And he said that ask a gambler and they'd tell you they were doing the right thing. What do you think gamblers say when they check themselves into rehab? Are they there because they're doing the right thing or because they've hit rock bottom? Let me help you out with that. You cannot check another person into a gambling rehab center because they have to check themselves in because they won't take someone unless that person has hit rock bottom. So to tell me that a gambler gives up happiness just because some arbitrary moral rule out there when he'd rather be happy, it's an incoherent concept. It doesn't even make sense. He challenged me. If something hasn't been made by something, then it has no purpose. And I asked him if I could come up with something that is completely explicable through natural mechanics, i.e. mindless forces acting upon inanimate objects making something, would that count? And he said no, because you haven't proved it isn't made by someone. Well, you can't prove a negative. If he was saying that Smurfs in the middle of the sun were what made it burn, and I said, well, there's all these natural explanations and mechanisms that would account for the burning of the sun with no appeal to Smurfs in its center, you can't just say, well, you haven't proven then that Smurfs aren't responsible for those natural means. Well, no, I haven't, but I can prove that there's no requirement for those Smurfs to exist, and that's about as close as you can get to proving something doesn't exist in any sensible way. He said, everything that's made by something else has a purpose. I am the product of my parents. My parents made me. Sex. It happens. But the purposes they tried to ingrain upon me are not necessarily my own. That's the beauty of living as an autonomous person. I determine what is purposeful in my life. If I want to look at the stars and learn about them, it doesn't matter what anybody else, any God, any human being wants of me. That has value to me, and therefore it's a purpose in my life. Marx said, in order to separate Mother Teresa from Hitler, that there must be some kind of independent standard out there. And there is a completely independent standard. What makes human beings happy is not something we determined. It's not like human beings got together and said, you know what? Pizza's going to taste good. We've decided that. No, the pizza tastes good regardless of what we want. And so if we want to be happy in life, we need to appeal to the way the universe actually is. It's not a matter of mere opinion. It's looking at the way the universe truly is. He said the high point of the universe is the human being. Do you know how many things God made before human beings? Every star, every galaxy. He made cockroaches before human beings. We're clearly very low on God's priority list. And even looking at this in terms of the universe. We are a small, insignificant, very fragile speck on a piece of dust floating throughout the universe. It looks like we're an accident more than anything else. To give you an analogy, imagine we were a flea trapped in an air bubble at the bottom of the ocean. We're going to die really quick unless we take matters into our own hands, and yet we're looking out at the ocean and all the fish. In our universe, which is the ocean in the analogy, the fish are black holes. They thrive in a vacuum. There are more black holes in this universe than grains of sand on the earth. If you're asking me what the universe looks like it was designed to produce, it sure as hell wasn't human beings. Going back to the flea at the bottom of the ocean analogy, for whom did Neptune make the ocean? For the flea or for the fish? Our universe looks like it was designed to create black holes. Human beings look like an afterthought. He said the prospect that order comes from chaos is illogical, and you don't have to be a scientist to figure this out. It may very well have helped if he was a scientist, because this is exactly what science has confirmed. In terms of, say, star creation, the gene's instability. All you need is a large cloud of hydrogen, large enough that it has enough mass to produce gravity. It'll pull itself together, spike the pressure in the center, and you'll have a much more complex, highly ordered star through forces that require no appeal to God, just mindless forces acting upon inanimate objects. This is in compliance with the second law of thermodynamics. It says we're moving towards a greater state of entropy, but it doesn't say that's all there is. All it says is as long as the disordered energy is greater than the ordered energy, the second law is conserved. A good example would be the atmosphere of the Earth. It's highly ordered, highly complex, been there for thousands of years, longer than that, millions of years, and will keep being there. If we move towards disorder in this universe, if pockets of order make no sense, why is that there? Well, it's explicable scientifically. you have atoms rubbing together, creating friction and heat. This is radiated out as dissipative energy into the universe. We still have pockets of order, even though we have disordered energy. And you can even reduce it to something simple. Rolling a dice. This is about as random as you can get. This is pretty chaotic, right? However, if you roll a 6-sided dice millions upon millions of times, at some point you're going to get a string of 56s. Chaos exists, but it doesn't preclude order. So to say that we need agency for order in our universe when we have all kinds of natural mechanisms that produce order all by themselves really does beg the question from their side. He said we have no empirical evidence for love. Love is a state of the brain, like happiness, like sadness. And the way we have empirical evidence for states of the brain, aside from fMRI imaging, which we can also use, is we see how people behave. When people are happy, they smile. When people are sad, they frown, they cry. And when people are in love, they act in particular ways. I propose to my fiancée because I love her. But God is not a state of the brain. I mean, no one denies that belief in God exists because people behave as if they believe in God. But God is not a state of the brain. God is something tangible. And if the existence of God is so important, why do we have so little evidence for God's existence in comparison to other truth claims about the universe? For instance, how important is the existence of this podium compared to the existence of God in terms of what is factual? Well, it's insignificant. Yet why do we have so much more evidence for this podium than we do for God? And my time's up, I'm done.
You can take
Oh, good, I'm going to keep going then. What lab experiment tells you that rape is evil? If you need a lab to tell you that rape makes people miserable, you're not trusting the evidence of your own eyes. If you really need it quantified in a lab to see that rape makes people unhappy, you're really rejecting any evidence that could reject your claim for a completely arbitrary reason. You can look at the number of rape help centers that are set up, or rape helplines, or hell, you could talk to a rape victim. If you need a lab to establish that for you, you have some real problems. And what's more, going back to the love example, when you talk about the mother saying, you know, how do you, when this child says, how do you know I love you? And the mother says to him, I'm here for you, I love for you, I care for you. That's a behavior that is indicative of a state of the mind. And what's more, you said, God loves us, He's here for us, He cares for us. This makes no sense to me, because the only justice we see in the universe is the justice meted out by human hands. If you think that we have captured every priest who has forced himself upon a little boy, your optimism has extended well into delusion. There are people in the world... There are people in the world right now who have committed atrocities who will simply never be caught. If a God exists that is at least as interested in justice as we are, that makes no sense. And what's more, if you're going to say that a God is here who takes care of us, the moment you look at a picture on Google Image of a child who is starving, and you think to yourself, if only I were there, I would feed that child. And you're just looking at a picture, and there are millions more of those pictures. You're talking about a God who is right beside every single one of those children, who could feed every single one of them. And the moment you decide that you would do what God has been unwilling to do, you have decided that you can come up with better moral conclusions than God, and you're right.
That is how much is left of your program. You could go up to 8 minutes on your, or sorry, 7 minutes on your final speech, if you need it, okay?
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to begin, as I had checked over with Adam before. I have new material in the rebuttal as well, but then, of course, Matt will have the opportunity to respond to it. Let me start by saying I thought it was rather impressive to hear JT talk about God creating things. I thought that was a breakthrough. I thought it was a little unusual, though, that he had a mistaken concept of chronology versus being. In other words, because something becomes first doesn't mean it's most important. We have the expression, you save the best for last. So I'm talking about the high point of creation. I would hope that JT would consider himself and Matt and everyone he loves as more important than a star, than a rock, than a tree, because they are.
And I'm the first one to acknowledge that. Now, I also want to say that as neither Matt nor I, or JT in this case, excuse me, are scientists, we're both coming from that premise, but I do want to address this concept of a star, that because a star has an ordering system that can increase, that necessarily concludes that it comes from the star. That's like in a previous conversation, JT used the example of a computer. That a computer, it's obvious that computers are intelligent because computers can think on their own. I would say, well, Bill Gates would have something to say about that, I think. I think also anybody who knows about a computer says a computer doesn't build itself, it doesn't program itself, it doesn't operate itself. You don't ask a computer information or even advice about dating or other things that are rather important because it's not intelligent. So because you see an order doesn't presuppose that you've proven that the order comes from the object. In fact, logic says order indicates one who's designed the order. Now, I want to go to three elements that I think in this effort for empirical, again, I think JT misunderstood my point entirely. I am saying that it's inappropriate to use an empirical standard for truth. So when you gave the examples of if you have to, if that guy needs a lab experiment to know that rape is wrong, I'm very sure rape is wrong, my friend. I've got 5 daughters, and I'm sure rape is wrong. My point is saying you can't expect an empirical standard for that, which is what you were requiring. That was my example. Now, I want to go to 3 areas in some effort to provide some empirical data that's relative to this question. Area number 1 is major modern atheists on our subject today. Do major modern atheists think that you can have a morality with God, without God? Some of the founding fathers, but also some of the leading proponents of atheism have answered with a lot of integrity, no. Marx, Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell. In fact, what Nietzsche said in his famous book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, is, God is dead and I'm worried. I'm worried that the whole global moral system is going to fall to shambles. Now that's wrong, but at least it's honest. At least there's an integrity with that. So atheists in their major voice have said to tonight's question, no. Many of the major atheists and saying, without God, you're not going to have a morality. Second area, major modern atheists' definition of person. And I want to make sure that you get this accurate, so I want to read these quotes. How do modern atheists define you and me, and therefore, how are we supposed to treat each other? Because, of course, that's the basis, right? If you're a piece of trash, if you're a dog, if you're something to be removed, you don't expect a morality to protect that. Why? Because you're not worth it. So listen to the definition of modern atheists. The French Du Maurier says, man is, quote, a fungus on a minor planet. Schoenberg, quote, man is a hairless ape. Sartre, man is a useless passion. Our own Oliver Wendell Holmes, man is no better than a grain of sand. If that's the case, how are you going to protect a woman from being raped? If she's no better than a hairless ape, fungus, slime, how are you going to get a moral system to say it's wrong to do this based on that definition? How are you going to stop kids from being abused? How are you going to stop sexual abuse from anybody, which is always intrinsically wrong, not based on some arbitrary God, but based on a God who gives an order based on the nature of the human being. It's not arbitrary, it's what protects humanity. Now, I also want to say in terms of stats, and again, this was dictated by an effort for getting as much empirical as we can. The last area are statistics regarding state atheistic governments. Now, these are objective studies. I encourage you to look at these. There's the Rommel study, which is the study of democide. How much death in what area takes place? You've got Johnson as a historian. You've got Barrett. You've got the very prestigious Paris-based Center for the History and the Culture of Communism, which are mostly atheistic societies presenting their own data regarding what is still the most commonly accepted moral wrong, which is murder. What do the statistics say? In the 20th century alone, when you combine 7 million of Lenin killing his own, when you combine 41 million of Stalin killing his own, when you add 72 million of Mao killing his own, when you add Angola and Zimbabwe and North Korea, what do you get as a grand total of state murders of their own people from an atheistic government? 180 million people in less than 100 years. Now, one would be quick to perhaps respond, yeah, but what about the Crusades? What about the Inquisition? What about the religious wars of the 17th century? Let's crunch the numbers on those, because that is something empirical. If you combine 8 crusades in 2 centuries, if you can combine the Inquisition of 3 centuries and the religious wars of the 17th century, you put those numbers together, it is equaled by the 1975 atheistic cleansing of Cambodia, 1/3 of its own people. When you look at the historical experiment and you do the numbers, the experiment of atheism as a moral foundation to protect people fails. So we're not just talking about a handful of well-intentioned and perhaps inconsistent atheists saying, I do want to be good, and I want to help others to be good, and I want to protect people. We're not talking about that. We're talking about whether atheism can sustain a global moral system to protect individuals. And the historical empirical data says a resounding and a frightening no, it can't. And that's why less than 1% of all governments in the last 2,000 years have been atheistic based. Of that less than 1%, you have more state murder of their own than 2,000 years of Christian governments. So what's the goal? The goal is to eliminate wrong and personal injury wherever it is, to respect people, to see the inherent dignity. And so that leads us to the fundamental conclusion, and this is what I'd like to conclude you with. It's not that individual atheists cannot be good. It's that atheism is not good for individuals. Atheism doesn't provide either a world system or a personal system that defends an atheist, that allows an atheist to have the same rights and the same protection of personal dignity and freedom and brilliance and creativity that every atheist and every theist deserve based on their definition of person, based on the existence of God. And that's why atheists deserve better than atheism. Thank you.
So I'd say don't clap, but I think that might be difficult at this point. I agree that we need something better than atheism as you define it. Thanks. This damn thing is kind of in here. So theism and atheism are merely positions on whether or not a God exists. Theism is simply the position that a God exists, not that it's a good God, not that the God is a source of morality. So when John Mark is talking about personal religious, he's letting his personal religious convictions, which he didn't bother to defend during the debate, infuse what he's talking about when he mentions theism. Because theism and atheism contain no information about what God thinks or what gods think, and cannot be used as a foundation for moral conclusions. They've built a case on theism and tried to argue a little bit for the existence of God, which is a debate we could probably have some other time if you want to. But you simply can't, they try to say that God is necessary therefore, or some God exists therefore, and therefore nothing. You simply can't get there from here. The existence or non-existence of God tells us nothing about reality, and that's why JT and I haven't built our case on atheism. We've built it on physical truths about reality. Morality, if it's about anything, is about the well-being of thinking creatures. What's good and bad is about which improve or diminish well-being. And John Mark talked about the value language synonym game, but I'm tying good to physical truths about our existence, and they're asserting that it's good because it comes from God, who they define as good.
I still don't know how we determined that God was the good one. Is it impossible that there's an evil deity? I'm also not arguing for the majority opinion, despite what John Mark suggested. My discussion of general rules was relative to the situation, not the individual. One of the criteria that I actually cited was about freedom versus slavery, and equality and fairness is something that we can attribute to everybody. The criteria are factual and data-driven. I'm not sure why having daughters gives you an understanding of why rape is wrong as opposed to simply being a human being, but I'm glad that having daughters does help you know why rape is wrong, and I'll point out that you didn't cite God as the reason why you know rape is wrong. Citing various definitions of atheism, which aren't actually definitions of atheism, but are various philosophical views that are consistent with atheism, is a non-starter. If I start saddling you with what Westboro Baptist Church said, I think you'd object to that. So let's debate what I've actually said and not dead or absent atheists and what they thought. The various states that you cite that were atheistic, many of them were in fact atheistic, although I would argue that they adopted and created a religion surrounding their leaders and particular ideologies. There has been no secular humanistic society to measure, and that is the position that I am advocating, because atheism has nothing to actually say about morality. It's once I stop believing in God, now I need some way to do this. Are you taking that as a win? Because, yeah. So, atheism itself has nothing to say about morality. And you ask, can atheism sustain a global system? No. And neither can the fact that I don't believe in fairies or elves. It's a single position on God. Everything else is a political or societal construct that may be consistent with atheism, but is not derived from atheism, and it's not a requirement or a global view of all atheists. Personal dignity and freedom that we atheists deserve, I agree, and those are Enlightenment principles that stood in the face of religious oppression and religious discrimination. Are there religions that advocate for those things? Absolutely. Are there versions of Christianity that advocate for those things? Absolutely. My position is not that all religions are bad or that all versions of Christianity are bad. Some people have managed to get it right in spite of all the bad stuff. Some people graduate. We have offered a case that is consistent with atheism, but would still be useful and true even if a God existed. If God exists, that doesn't change whether or not slavery is immoral. And no matter how many holy books or gods explicitly advocate for slavery, it's still immoral to own people as property. I mean, this isn't even a question anymore. We solved this and we don't talk about that part of our holy book. That atheism is a failure on addressing the big questions. Atheism doesn't attempt to address the big questions. It's a position on a single issue. Do we have sufficient reasonable evidence to justify belief in a God? That may be a big question, but I don't think it's a particularly hard question, and the answer is clearly no. You see, either a God exists or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, we're done. If it does, it either interacts with reality in some detectable way, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, its existence is indistinguishable from its non-existence. So to have any productive conversation, we must be talking about a God that manifests in some detectable way in reality. Meanwhile, theists are running around claiming to be little God detectors and talking about all the things that God does, which means we should be able to investigate and get measurable data to at least confirm that there are phenomenon, even though we cannot confirm a supernatural source. If the evidence for the existence of God was as demonstrable as the existence of my mother, or actually even as demonstrable as the existence of my mother's love, I'd have no issue here. That's just not the case. There was booing about the mention of child rape, and I'm going to steal something shamelessly from one of the co-hosts on my show and modify it. If I saw someone attempting to rape a child, I would intervene and do everything I could to stop it. While God seemed to sit by, close the door, and say, I'll take care of you later, maybe. Which makes me objectively more moral than those gods. And that's true for all of us. Morality is about us, the participants in reality, the people whose well-being is at issue. We need no external pronouncements from non-participants, and if those non-participant gods exist and have moral information to share with us, I will be happy to consider it, and it will still be accepted or rejected based on reason, evidence, and empathy. We are all using the same processes to determine what is good and what is evil, or if something qualifies. I'll consider all that information within the context of the secular moral reasoning that I've advocated. The idea that we would accept moral proclamations that violate good sense and evidence is absurd. Fortunately, all those proposed gods seem remarkably silent, though humans do profess to speak for them. But the value of those insights is determined without consideration for the source at all. Ideas, including moral pronouncements, stand and fall on their own merits, with no regard to the author of those ideas. No care at all about whether the author is a god or a garbage collector. And that's not a slight to garbage collectors, because as participants, valuable participants in our system, I have infinitely more respect for garbage collectors than gods.
It does appear that the speakers have used the allotted time for the entire debate. We do not have time for questions. I'm sure all of them would be happy to carry on these discussions in the hallways. Don't leave if you want to watch Nate Phelps. It's a fantastic presentation coming up. We've really been looking forward to it. He's a good guy. So we're going to get things set up for his presentation, which will come next. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending Moral Combat. A round of applause for our debaters.